He and the Apache girl ran away from the whole world until they found a hut on a cliff. They thought it was empty. But the man who lived there knew their names and had been waiting for them his whole life. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The desert was a pale sea of dust and silence when Eli Walker rode through it, his horse stumbling beneath the weight of a man who had forgotten what it meant to belong anywhere. The wind blew dry across the horizon, carrying the bitter scent of mesquite and sunburned earth. Behind him stretched the ghost of the war, a long trail of towns burned out, men buried nameless under the sand, and orders shouted by men who no longer remembered why they fought. He had worn the gray coat once, the color of old ash, and though the war had ended, its smoke clung to him. He had been a soldier, a scout, and then something less definable. A man paid to carry a gun, a shadow moving from one dusty outpost to another. The West had no shortage of men like him, but few carried silence the way he did. He was headed nowhere particular when the bullet found him. It came from behind a tumbleweed rise, from a drunken gang of highwaymen who thought they'd found easy prey. His horse reared, the shot tearing through his shoulder, and he hit the ground hard. The desert closed over him, hot and merciless. The men didn't bother to check if he lived. They took his saddlebag, his revolver, and left him to die. When the light began to blur into evening, and the sky reddened like a wound that wouldn't heal, Eli thought of water. Not the kind in canteens, but rain, the smell of wet soil in Kentucky before the war. He thought of that and waited for death. But death did not come. At some point, there were footsteps, soft, deliberate, not the stride of a man. A shadow knelt beside him. He remembered the smell of sage and smoke, the faint touch of fingers searching for a pulse. When his eyes opened again, it was to the sight of a face he could not name. Bronze skin, black hair braided with a strip of red cloth, eyes dark as the storm that gathers behind mountains. She didn't speak. She pressed a damp cloth to his wound, poured something bitter between his lips, and he drifted again into sleep. When he woke, it was in a small shelter built from reeds and clay, somewhere deep in a canyon. The wound had been cleaned and bandaged. The woman sat nearby, grinding herbs in a bowl, humming a low tune that seemed older than the wind itself. For days he could not speak much. She tended him without question, feeding him broth, forcing him to drink water. Her name, he learned only after the fever passed, was Naya. She spoke little English, but enough to make herself understood. "You fight?" she asked once, pointing to the scar on his chest. "Long time ago," he said. "Too long." She only nodded, as if she had known the answer already. Weeks passed. He helped her mend the roof of her hut, hunted small game when his shoulder allowed, and fixed a broken wooden bowl with a piece of wire. She laughed when he did that, not unkindly. "You fix everything," she said, touching the edge of the bowl, "even what must break." He didn't answer. At night, the fire cast long shadows against the wall, and she would sing in a tongue he didn't know. The melody was soft, mournful, and it filled the air like the echo of rain he once dreamed of. But nothing in that world stayed hidden for long. One morning, riders appeared on the ridgemen from her tribe. They had come looking for her, and when they saw Eli, their faces hardened. Words were exchanged that he didn't understand, though he could hear the anger in them. One of the men spat at the ground between them. Naya's eyes burned with something fierce, half shame, half defiance. When they left, she didn't follow. That night she packed her things silently, a small pouch of herbs, a blanket, a knife made of bone. Eli told her to go. "They're your people," he said. "You can't leave everything for a stranger." But she only looked at him and said, "You are not stranger now." They left before dawn, The desert was still cool then, the stars fading behind the pink of the horizon. They walked together, sharing one horse between them. There was no destination, only direction away. They crossed arroyos, slept beside dry creeks, and lived on what little they could hunt. When they reached an old oak tree on the edge of a valley, she stopped and turned to him. From her pouch, she took a feather, long and silver gray, the feather of a hawk. She tied it around his wrist with a strip of leather. He cut a ring from a root he'd dug the day before and placed it in her palm. They said no vows in any church, but both felt the weight of something sacred in the air. The days became years of motion. They worked when work could be found. Eli repaired fences and mended wagons for farmers who paid in food instead of coin. Naya healed children with crushed leaves and poultices. People whispered about them. Some said she was a witch, others that she was his slave. But in time, the whispers quieted. There was dignity in their quiet, and even the cruelest tongues found little to say. Still, they never stayed long. Trouble always traveled faster than peace. One winter, they made camp in the canyon near an abandoned mine. Snow fell in silence, burying the world under white dust. Eli built a small clay stove, and they survived on rabbit meat and cornmeal. At night, they talked of what lay beyond the next ridge, of land untouched by war or fences. "We could build there," he said once. "A house, maybe. A place that's ours." She smiled faintly. "A place that listens," she said. "Land that hears." He didn't understand, but he liked the way she said it. The war still haunted his sleep. Sometimes he woke gasping, seeing flames and hearing the cries of people he couldn't save. Once, when the nightmares were worst, he confessed what he had done, that he had ridden with men who burned villages, that he had seen children die. Naya listened in silence, and when he finished, she said only, "The wind remembers all things, but it forgives what listens." He didn't know what forgiveness meant anymore, but her words eased something deep in him. Then came the day his past caught up. In a dusty town near San Pedro, a group of ex-soldiers recognized him. Drunk and loud, they mocked him for traveling with an Apache woman, called her names he wouldn't repeat. He tried to walk away. But when one reached for his gun, Eli drew first. It was over in seconds. 2 men down, 1 wounded. The silence that followed was worse than the gunfire. Naya stood behind him, her face pale, her hands trembling. She had never seen him kill. That night, they buried the guns in the sand and fled the town. Neither spoke for a long time. The desert swallowed their words. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was quiet, but steady. "You cannot run from what you are," she said, "but you can choose where it ends." He looked at her and nodded. "Then it ends somewhere no one finds us." They rode north, toward the mountains, where the air grew thin and the rivers were still clean. Days bled into weeks, and every sunrise felt like borrowed time. The horse grew lean, their supplies thinner. Yet for the first time since he'd met her, Eli felt they were heading towards something. Not away. At night, when the stars burned like cold fire over the ridges, Naya would hum the same song she'd sung long ago in the hut. It rose and fell with the wind, blending into the sigh of the earth. One evening, while they camped near a canyon, she told him a story. Her grandfather, she said, once spoke of a house built on a high rock where the sky touched the land. "It is where the wind sleeps," she said. He said no one can find it unless the land itself calls them. Eli listened, his hand tracing the rough wood of his rifle. "And if we find it," he asked, "then maybe the land wants us to stay." He didn't know if he believed in such things, but something in her voice made him hope. He thought of the ring of root, the hawk's feather. The years of wandering. Somewhere, perhaps, there was a place that could hold all of it, the love, the guilt, the longing for silence. A place that might finally stop the road from stretching any farther. When the sun rose the next morning, the light hit the mountains in long golden lines. The air was crisp, cold, and alive. They packed their few things, mounted their horse, and began to climb toward the unknown. The path wound upward through sage and stone, the wind stronger with every step. Below them, the desert shimmered like a forgotten memory. Ahead, the mountains waited, silent and ancient. Naya turned in the saddle and looked back once, then forward again. "Do you hear it?" she asked softly. "Hear what?" "The wind. It's calling us." He listened. There was only the faint whistle through the rocks. But something in that sound stirred him, a low, haunting note that felt almost like a voice. He didn't answer. He simply tightened the reins and followed the sound higher into the mountains, where the air thinned and the world grew quiet enough for the land itself to listen. And though neither of them knew it yet, the road that had carried them so far from every home they had ever known was about to end on a lonely, towering cliff where an old man waited for the wind to bring his bloodline home. The wind grew colder as they climbed, sharp and steady, the kind that carried whispers through the mountain passes and made the horses uneasy. Below them, the desert stretched like an old memory golden, endless and indifferent. The trail was narrow, carved into the rock long ago by hands that no longer existed. Each step of the horse sent pebbles tumbling into the ravine, their faint echoes swallowed by the vast silence. Eli rode ahead, his arms still bandaged from the last encounter, while Naya followed close behind, her eyes scanning the slopes as though the land itself were speaking to her in a language only she could understand. They had been traveling for days, sleeping under ledges and feeding on whatever roots or game they could find. The nights were long and heavy with cold. Sometimes Eli would wake and find Naya standing on a ridge, looking up at the stars. "He's watching," she once whispered when he asked who she meant. "The old one. The one who built the house where the sky sleeps." He had said nothing, because in her voice was that strange conviction he had come to trust, the certainty that somewhere beyond their reach, something greater than either of them was waiting. On the 6th day, when the sun rose pale behind a veil of cloud, they found it. The path opened into a high plateau, and at the edge of it stood a rock formation that seemed almost human, an immense hand of stone reaching into the heavens. At its fingertip, poised like a bird's nest above the abyss, stood a small wooden house. Its roof was darkened by years of wind and rain, its walls etched with strange carvings, and thin smoke curled upward from a crooked chimney. It looked abandoned and alive at once, as though time had forgotten to finish its work there. Naya dismounted first, her boots sinking slightly into the frost. "This is it," she said softly. "I know this place." Eli looked at her, then at the house. "You've been here before?" She shook her head. "No, but he has." She pointed toward the sky. "My mother's father. Toha. He disappeared before the war. They said he went into the mountains to talk to the wind. They said he never came back." They followed the narrow path upward. It was steep and winding, and by the time they reached the top, the sun was sinking low. The door of the house stood open, swaying gently. Eli called out, but no answer came. He stepped inside, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. The air smelled of cedar smoke and sage. On the far wall hung a bow, old but polished, and beside it, a series of painted symbols. Circles within circles, spirals of red and black. In the corner sat a fire, still burning low, as if it had been waiting for them. A sound came from behind slow footsteps, steady despite their age. Eli turned, ready to draw, but Naya caught his arm before he could. At the doorway stood an old man, wrapped in a blanket of woven fiber, his gray hair braided down his back. His eyes were dark and deep, filled with something older than fear. He looked at Naya for a long time, saying nothing. Then he spoke in Apache, his voice cracked but strong. She froze, tears gathering in her eyes. Eli didn't understand the words, but he saw what they meant. The old man reached out a trembling hand, touched Naya's cheek, and murmured her name as though it were a prayer he'd carried for too long. Then, turning to Eli, he said in broken English, "You are the man she walked with through the storm." His tone held neither welcome nor threat-only recognition. They stayed that night in silence. The old man gave them food-smoked fish and bitter roots, and listened as Naya told him their story in low, careful words. He didn't interrupt her, didn't judge her. When she finished, he looked at the fire and said, "The land brings back what it needs. The wind told me 2 shadows were coming. One born from fire, one from the rain. Now they are here." The days that followed were strange and quiet. Eli helped with repairs to the roof, replacing rotted beams with new timber from the nearby pines. The work gave his hands purpose again, though he felt the weight of the old man's eyes on him. Toha rarely spoke to him directly. When he did, it was always in riddles. "A man's strength is not in his arms," he said once, watching Eli hammer a plank. "It is in how long he can carry silence without letting it poison him." Naya spent her time learning from her grandfather. He showed her how to read the direction of the wind by the trembling of grass, how to make medicine from crushed bark, and how to listen to the ground as if it had breath. Eli would see them sometimes at dawn, sitting cross-legged near the cliff, the light spilling over them like smoke. Their voices were low, blending with the whisper of the air. He envied them in a quiet way. For all his strength, he had never learned to belong anywhere. Yet the peace that hung over the house was fragile. At night, Eli could see distant campfires flickering far below in the valley. There were miners down there, and settlers' men who didn't like the idea of Indians living on land that might one day yield gold or timber. The rumor of a witch's house on the cliff began to spread, carried by traders who had glimpsed Naya's silhouette on the ridge. Eli sensed trouble long before it came. One afternoon, while he was cutting firewood, 3 men rode up the trail. They were rough-looking, unshaven, with the heavy confidence of those who believed the mountains belonged to them. Their leader dismounted and called out, "You folks up there, that's government land you're squatting on." Eli stepped forward, his axe in his hand. The man sneered. "Don't reach for that, friend. We ain't here for a fight yet." Naya appeared beside him, her posture calm, but her eyes sharp. "This is not your land," she said evenly. "It belongs to no man." The leader laughed. "Spoken like a true savage. Maybe we'll come back when the marshal's with us. Then we'll see whose land it is." When they were gone, the mountain seemed to hold its breath. That evening, Toha lit a torch and walked to the edge of the cliff. He raised it high, chanting something in the old tongue, his voice carrying far into the dark. Eli watched from a distance, not understanding, but feeling the power in it. When the chant ended, the wind rose sharply, scattering sparks into the night. "They will not come soon," the old man said when he returned. "The mountain has spoken." Still, Eli couldn't shake his unease. He spent the next days strengthening the walls, adding supports, and setting traps along the lower path. Toha watched, but did not interfere. You build because you fear, he said. Fear builds high walls, but love makes roots. Which one do you plant here? Eli didn't answer. As the weeks passed, something shifted between them. The old man began to trust him in small ways. Once he asked Eli to carve new beams for the porch. The wood will test your heart, Toha said. Breaks for those who rush. Eli worked slowly, letting the rhythm of the hammer steady his thoughts. When the last beam was set, a sudden gust of wind tore across the cliff, but the structure held firm. The old man nodded. Now the house knows you, he said. You are part of it. That night, Toha handed Eli a small charm carved from obsidian, half a sun, half a moon, joined by a single line. 2 worlds, he said. 1 heart. The land will remember. Eli took it with quiet reverence. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. The days turned gentle after that. Naya sang again, the same songs she had once sung by the river, and Eli found himself humming along. The air grew warmer, the sky clearer. For a while, it seemed they had outrun everything. The war, the fear, the past. The house on the cliff became a home. But peace is a fragile thing in a world that still remembers violence. One afternoon, the same men returned, this time with others, 6 in all, armed and angry. They stopped at the base of the trail and shouted threats upward. Eli reached for his rifle, but Toha stopped him. The mountain protects its own, the old man said calmly. Then he walked out to meet them, carrying only a burning branch. His figure was small against the sky, but his voice carried like thunder. He told them the land was cursed, that whoever tried to claim it would be buried beneath its stones. The men hesitated, uneasy, then retreated, muttering about witches and devils. When they were gone, Toha came back slowly, his breath shallow. They will return, he said quietly, but not before the wind is ready. That night, the 3 of them sat together by the fire. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks, a low song that rose and fell like breathing. Naya leaned her head on Eli's shoulder. The mountain listens, she whispered. He nodded, feeling the warmth of her against him, the steady pulse of life in a world that had once tried to take everything from them. As the flames flickered lower, the old man's shadow moved across the wall, tall and wavering, like a tree bending before a storm. When the wind calls again, he said softly, someone must stay to answer. None of them spoke after that. The night stretched long and still, and far below the valley lay drowned in darkness. The house creaked gently, as if it, too, were breathing. And somewhere in the silence, Eli felt the faint stirring of something eternal, the sense that the land had accepted them, if only for a while. Morning came cold and bright. Toha stood on the porch watching the sunrise, his blanket drawn tight around him. Naya stood beside him, her hand in his. When Eli joined them, the old man turned and said, "You have built well. The mountain will remember you." He smiled faintly, a smile that carried the weight of generations. "But remember, Walker, the wind always comes back." Eli nodded. He didn't understand all of it, but he knew this much. Whatever trials lay ahead, whatever storm the wind would bring, this place had chosen them. The road that had led them so far had finally ended, not in running or hiding, but in stillness. For the first time, he felt what it meant to stay. And as the sun rose higher, casting gold across the peaks, the house on the cliff stood strong against the wind, a promise carved into the sky, waiting for the last lesson the mountain still had to give. Winter came late to the mountains, as if the wind itself hesitated to bring cold into a place that had already seen too much silence. Frost began to trace the edges of the windows, and thin snow settled over the roof, turning the house into a gray silhouette against the pale sky. Inside, the fire burned steadily, fed by Eli's careful hands, and Naya's bundles of dried cedar. The old man, Toha, sat wrapped in his blanket by the hearth, his breath shallow but even, his eyes following the smoke as it curled toward the rafters. He spoke less with each passing day. His voice, when it came, was softer now, like the whisper of water under ice. Eli noticed the change before Naya did. The old man's movements grew slower. His gaze seemed to drift past the living world. Yet there was no fear in him. Sometimes, when Eli entered the room at night, he would find Toha staring into the fire, lips moving in silent words. When Eli once asked what he was saying, the old man smiled faintly and replied, "I am asking the fire to remember me when the wind forgets." Naya sat close by, learning from him until her eyes grew heavy. She would wake in the mornings to find him still sitting, still watching the flames. One evening, as snow began to fall in heavy flakes, Toha called them both to him. His voice carried the weight of something final. "The time is short," he said. "When the snow melts, the song will begin." Naya knelt beside him, clutching his hand. "Don't speak of leaving," she whispered, but he only smiled. "The mountain does not mourn what it gives back to the sky." He reached into the folds of his blanket and took out two objects, a small pouch made of deer hide and a smooth stone carved with the symbol of the sun and moon. The pouch he placed in Naya's hands. "This is my breath," he said. "When you hear the wind sing, open it. Set me free." To Eli, he gave the stone. "You carry both worlds, Walker. Fire and rain. Let neither rule you." That night, he slept beside the fire, and in the gray hours before dawn, his breath simply stopped. Naya woke to the sound of silence, the kind that follows after a long song has ended. She touched his face, still warm, and whispered something in Apache that Eli didn't understand. He felt an ache in his chest, not sharp like grief, but deep, like the settling of earth after a long tremor. Together, they carried the old man's body outside. The snow had stopped, and the sky was clear, painted with the faint light of early morning. They buried him at the edge of the cliff, where the wind was strongest, and when the first rays of sun broke over the valley, the world seemed to pause. A gust lifted the loose snow, swirling it around them like white ash. It was as if the mountain itself was breathing him away. The days that followed were quiet. Naya spoke little. She spent hours sitting by the grave, her eyes lost in the distance. Eli busied himself with the roof, the woodpile, the traps they had set for rabbits. But he could feel the stillness pressing against him, heavy and expectant. Sometimes, when the wind rose, he could swear he heard a low hum coming from the cliffs, a sound too deep to be mere air. It reminded him of a voice half-remembered, a chant he had heard Toha murmur on the night the trespassers had come. The mountain was not silent. It was waiting. When spring came, the thaw arrived suddenly. The snow melted in long silver veins, and the rivers below swelled with new life. One morning, Naya came to him with the pouch in her hands. "It's time," she said. He knew what she meant. They climbed together to the highest point of the ridge, where the air was thin and the horizon endless. She untied the string, and the ashes caught the wind, scattering into the open sky. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the air began to tremble, and a faint melody rose. Not a song, not exactly, but a rhythm in the wind, as if the mountain itself was humming through its stones. Naya closed her eyes. "He is home," she said. Eli stood behind her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Then so are we." Peace returned, but it did not stay long. Word of the house and its strange inhabitants had spread through the nearby settlements. Stories twisted with every telling. Some said it was a den of outlaws, others that it was haunted by an Indian ghost. In the valley below, the sheriff and a group of soldiers gathered, intent on driving them out. When Eli saw the glint of metal on the trail, he knew trouble had come again. They arrived at noon, shouting up toward the house. "This land belongs to the government," one called. "You got no right to be here." "We'll give you an hour to clear out." Eli stepped to the edge of the porch, his rifle slung across his back. "This land belongs to no one," he said evenly. "It's been here before your laws, and it'll be here after." The sheriff, a thick man with a red beard, spat into the dirt. "We'll see about that." The gunfire started without warning. Bullets tore into the rocks, splintering the posts of the porch. Naya pulled Eli down behind the wall, grabbing her bow from beside the door. "They'll burn the house," she said. "They'll never stop." Her voice was steady, but he saw the fear in her eyes. He took her hand. "Then we stand with it." The fight lasted longer than it should have. Eli fired sparingly, aiming to frighten more than to kill, but they were many. A bullet grazed his side, tearing through his coat. Naya's arrow sang through the air, finding their mark in the dust near the men's feet, driving them back. Then the wind began to rise. At first it was only a whisper, but soon it grew into a low roar that swept through the canyon, carrying dust and loose stones with it. The men below shouted, their horses rearing. A flash of lightning split the sky, though there had been no sign of storm. The ground shuddered beneath them. Eli grabbed Naya, pulling her back as a section of the cliff edge gave way with a thunderous crack. The path the attackers had used crumbled into the ravine, cutting them off. Through the chaos, the wind screamed like a living thing, wrapping around the house, shaking it, but never breaking it. When it finally began to calm, the men were gone, retreated or buried. He could not tell. The storm left behind a heavy stillness, broken only by the rattle of the shutters and the distant rumble of falling stones. When the silence settled, Naya went to the edge of the cliff. The air smelled of rain and earth, though no rain had fallen. She knelt and pressed her palm against the ground. "He kept his word," she said softly. "The mountain protects its own." Eli stood beside her, blood seeping through his shirt. Or maybe it remembered his song. They spent the next days repairing what the storm had spared. The house had held, just as Toha promised it would. The veranda stood firm, the beams Eli had built still strong. The amulet he wore, a stone half-sun, half-moon hung warm against his chest, though the air was cold. He could feel its weight not as a burden, but as a heartbeat. At night, the wind no longer howled. It hummed softly, like the memory of an old friend. When his wound had healed enough for him to work, he began planting a small patch of earth behind the house. Naya watched him from the porch, smiling faintly. "You plant now," she said. "You, who never stayed anywhere long enough for the seeds to grow." He looked up, the shadow of a grin crossing his face. "Maybe it's time I learned." Together they worked the soil, their hands dark with dirt, the smell of life returning to the mountain. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the cliffs in fire, Eli stood on the porch and looked out over the valley. Smoke from the settlements curled far below, faint and harmless. "Do you think they'll come back?" he asked. Naya shook her head. "No. They heard what they needed to." The wind shifted then, warm and steady, brushing against them like a familiar hand. She took the small pouch from her belt, the one that had once held her grandfather's ashes, and let it go. It rose into the air, empty now, but the wind caught it and carried it away into the fading light. That night, they sat by the fire in silence, The house creaked gently in the wind. Outside, the stars hung low and clear, their reflections trembling in the river far below. Naya leaned her head against his shoulder, her hair smelling faintly of cedar smoke. "The land hears us," she murmured, "and we hear it." He turned to look at her, the firelight flickering across her face. "Then maybe," he said, "we finally belong." Years passed quietly. The seasons moved like long breaths. Travelers who passed through the valley spoke of a light on the mountain, a fire that never died. Some said they had seen figures at dusk, a man and a woman standing on the edge of the cliff, hand in hand. Others claimed the wind. There carried a song, a deep, haunting tune that spoke of peace and storms and love that defied the years. Eli never left the mountain again. He grew old, as all men do, his hair turning the color of the ash he once carried in his heart. Naya aged more slowly, her strength bound to the land, in ways he could never fully grasp. Together, they watched the valley change, the railroads creeping closer, the forests thinning, the rivers bridged. Yet still, the house on the cliff remained untouched. When the time came for him to rest, he asked her to take him to the same place where Toha had been laid. She did, and the wind was gentle that day. "You'll stay here," she said quietly. "The mountain will remember." His hand found hers, rough and warm. "I already hear it singing," he whispered. She smiled through her tears, pressing the amulet to his chest. "Then sleep," she said. "It will finish the song." Long after his voice had faded, the wind rose again over the cliff, carrying with it a melody that blended with the rustle of leaves and the sigh of the earth. The house stood silent, but not empty. Those who climbed the mountain in later years would swear they heard the faint hum of two voices in the wind, one deep and steady, one soft and clear singing to each other across time. And so the story became a legend, told by travelers beside their fires, of a white man and an Apache woman who built a home where the sky met the stone, of an old spirit who guarded them until the mountain itself took them in, and of a place where the earth still sings for those who loved it enough to listen. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next one, and share this video with someone who still believes that love can outlast the storm.